My name is Pam Hine, Senior Project Associate with the SOAR TA Center, and I will be your moderator today. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items to review. A quick disclaimer. This training is supported by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration and the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. The contents of this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of SAMHSA or DHHS. The training should not be considered substitutes for individualized care and treatment decisions. Just a few webinar instructions. As a reminder, your lines will be muted throughout the entire webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for download on the SOAR website in about a week. There are a couple of ways you can download the PowerPoint slides and other handouts now. One way is by going to the top left of your screen and clicking File, then click Save, then click Document. Or you can also visit the SOAR website at www.soarworks.samhsa.gov. Click Webinars on the left sidebar and choose today's topic. The link to the SOAR website can be found in the reminder emails you received about this webinar, and you will also receive an email after the webinar with a link to the materials. We recommend if you're having difficulty downloading, just sit back and listen to the panelists, as we will make sure you have access to the slides after the webinar. ASL interpretation and live captioning are available to enhance accessibility. To view captioning, click Accept in the multimedia pod on the lower right-hand corner of your WebEx screen. Change the color contrast to suit your needs. We recommend high contrast for best visibility. At the conclusion of the webinar, you will be asked to fill out a very brief evaluation, which we kindly ask you to complete. And finally, we will save all questions and comments until the end of the presentation. You're welcome to post questions via the Q&A box at the lower right-hand portion of the screen. Just a few learning objectives. It is our intention that by the end of the webinar, you will understand how to access and utilize the MSR interview guide and template, and understand how to address implicit bias considerations while writing your document, and how to gather information while making the SOAR applicant feel comfortable sharing their story, and why the MSR telling the applicant's story is an important step in the SOAR process, which describes the applicant's struggle to function. A review of the agenda. So to reach these objectives, we will begin this afternoon with presentations from Sumitra Polkato, Project Associate here at the TA Center, along with Amanda Starkey with the TA Center, who will do a presentation with Carrie Vanderblumer, who is a Disability Examiner Manager in Michigan. And then we'll hear from Lauren Rodriguez, a SOAR Benefit Specialist with SAFE Austin, along with Jennifer, who is a SOAR beneficiary, who will share tips on how to interview for the medical summary report. So now I'll turn it over to Asha Stanley with SAMHSA, who will provide today's welcome. Asha?
Thank you, Pam. A warm welcome to all of you joining us today. On behalf of SAMHSA, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar titled The Medical Summary Report, a deep dive for SOAR providers. Today's webinar will give you many practical tips to help you better understand how to write effective and culturally aware medical summary reports, or MSRs. Today's panelists will walk you through a sample MSR to highlight key information to include and information to avoid. Also, a SOAR provider and SOAR beneficiary will share their experience throughout the MSR interviewing and writing process. From their experience, you will learn tips on how to help SOAR applicants feel more comfortable sharing their stories. I would like to welcome and thank our presenters for your willingness to share your expertise and experiences with us. I will turn it back over to Pam Hine, who will be moderating today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Asha, for your welcome and supporting our webinars. I will now turn the mic over to Sumitra, who will kick things off. Sumitra, you begin your presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Pam. And I'm very excited to be discussing the SOAR critical component today of the medical summary report. So I'm going to kick things off with this webinar talking about a really important piece of the information gathering process for beginning to write a medical summary report. And that's talking about how we can reduce implicit bias in our writing. The clients that we serve here with SOAR applications, they are complex whole beings with an abundance of life experiences that have impacted who they are, how they interact with others, behaviors they may have developed over time. And the medical summary report is a very, very critical tool in being able to help get that information across to the GDS examiner. For those of you on the call that do this work, the SOAR providers, we all know that the medical summary report does a number of important things, right? It provides greater insight into the history and development of the applicant's impairments. It can help us gather collateral information to give greater insight into their functioning. But one of the most important pieces of it, right, is that it provides an opportunity to help the DDS examiner see that applicant and obtain a complete picture of their story. And while there are many opportunities in the medical summary report for us to convey this important information, there also exists the possibility of implicit bias maintaining a presence within these reports. If you're unfamiliar with the term, implicit bias is a term that's typically used to describe when we have attitudes towards people or if we associate certain stereotypes with them without our conscious knowledge. And so the key words here being implicit and being unconscious, right? So meaning that oftentimes when we do this, we're often aware that we're doing it, or we may be mistaken about the words that we're using or mistaken about the information that may be conveying. So let's think about this for a moment within the context of our SOAR work, right? So the DDS examiner is most likely never going to meet the applicant, never actually talk to them, never actually see them, speak to them, ask them questions. Their only introduction to that applicant is coming from the information that we are providing to them within that medical summary report. The words that we are putting down on paper has the power to really influence the way that DDS conceptualizes that entire applicant, right? From the way that they look, from the way that they talk, from the way that they behave. So think about that. Like really sit with that and think about that for a moment. That is the potential lot of power and influence that SOAR providers that we hold, or that we may hold, I should say. So let me give you an example, right? So if I say the sentence or speak the words that Sally Sue is a 32-year-old drug addict, when I said those words, did a certain image come to your mind when you heard that? Did certain feelings surface? Did other thoughts automatically come to mind? And chances are it probably did, right? Because that's how implicit bias operates. Not that you necessarily, thought a certain way about Sally Sue or whatnot, but when you heard those words, you most likely pictured something, right? Or thought something, right? And that occurs because the brain's natural tendency to look for patterns and associations in the world, right? There's so much information that we're constantly inundated with that making those mental shortcuts make it faster and easier to process information. And while that's very convenient for that aspect of our bodies, it also leaves us susceptible to biases because of these tendencies. We here at the San Francisco TA Center, we are committed to encouraging diversity, equity, inclusion throughout all aspects of the SOAR process, and with providing you all the tools that you need to also be able to be successful in being able to do so. So, briefly on this webinar, I'm going to review 2 new resources that we've created and designed to help reduce implicit biases within your medical summary report. So the first tool that we are talking about is it's a supplement to our existing medical summary report guide. So this is a supplemental tool that really kind of goes through some DEI considerations. And so on this form, it's information of various categories, some that you see here, including others. It lists out some categories, and it helps you to identify information that may be most relevant within that category to that applicant's functioning, and it gives you some considerations to include in your medical summary report. So some of the categories, again, you see some demographic information there, race, gender, sexual orientation. There's also legal history. There's often substance use as well. And so it kind of asks you questions, right? So, for example, if we are mentioning, some of those demographics like the client's race or gender or sexual orientation, what might be relevant is, have they experienced trauma that can be connected to discrimination based off of those demographics? Is there historical trauma? And do they influence the applicant's current ability to function, right? So it kind of gives you the little tips and tricks and suggestions of things to think about to include in your medical summary report that is relevant to that applicant's functioning. The second tool that we are going over is our existing MSR interview guide. And with that, there are just some new information and some new notes that we want to point out that's here in the template. So within this tool, it really kind of puts an emphasis on trauma-informed interviewing, right? Because we're talking so much about being aware of the various factors that influence a person's being and functioning and who they are. And while they're important, we want to make sure that if we are mentioning and talking about them, that they are relevant to their functioning and that they are relevant to be included in the MSR. So it really kind of gives you some tips and tricks on how you go about gathering this information in a trauma-informed way. This guidance of this tool also asks you to consider how that applicant's racial, ethnic, cultural backgrounds, how that may impact their perceptions regarding their disabilities, their diagnoses or symptoms, and their treatment, and be mindful of how this may impact your opinions, feelings, and attitudes towards that client's functioning. Because again, as we go back and we remember with implicit bias, oftentimes it's something ingrained, it's something unconscious, and it may not always align with what we believe or think or feel explicitly, right, what we present out, but there still might be those unconscious assumptions, right? So it really kind of talks about how to be aware of your own feelings and attitudes and thoughts that you may have associated with certain terms, to be aware of them, and to really gather information and write your MSR in a way that isn't possibly sneaking those little implicit biases in there. So if we take that same example that we used, right, where we talked about Sally Sue being a 32-year-old drug addict, if we wrote something that Sally Sue is a 32-year-old woman who has experienced a substance use diagnosis. Now, when you hear those words and worded in that way, does that bring up a more neutral image? Does that bring up more neutral thoughts? Does that maybe not bring up the same image that maybe you thought about with the first sentence that I stated? Probably so, right? And so again, the tool really just kind of goes over, how to help you capture this information in a sensitive way and provide the information, in a neutral way that is not including those implicit biases as well, okay? So all of these tools, both of these tools, are available to you in our SOARworks library on the SOAR TA Center website, so please feel free to utilize them as needed. As you go forward and continue doing the amazing work that you all do, changing lives, saving lives, please always just kind of remember the power inherently that we have in writing these medical summary reports. And in the words of the great philosopher Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And so when we write about our applicants' past legal histories or substance use histories, or when we're describing their appearances or their gender or their sexual orientations, just always think back to yourself, are our words being used to help or to harm? When we write about these aspects of the applicant, are we writing about it because it's relevant to the applicant's functioning and that it's helping to provide further insight? And we hope that the question will always be yes, and we've got these tools to guide you. So please feel free to use them as necessary. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Pam. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Sumitra, so much. It's always good to have a great Spider-Man reference to illustrate our points here. Now we're going to turn it over to Amanda and Carrie, who are going to take us through that deep dive of an actual MSR that they wrote. So Amanda and Carrie, it's all yours.
Thanks, Pam. So in this deep dive, we're going to take a look at a sample medical summary report and at the same time interview Carrie, who has the perspective of a DES examiner manager, to give us the background of what goes on behind the scenes when a DES examiner is reading a medical summary report, and what are the most important pieces of information to include, and maybe what can we leave out of the medical summary report. So we hope that you'll really enjoy this and get some great information to help inform your future MSRs. So Carrie, thank you for joining us on the MSR, and I do have a question to get started before we dig into this sample medical summary report. So first, can you provide an overview of what the disability determination process looks like from the DES examiner's perspective? So more of a bird's eye view of what's happening as you process an application.
Sure. In a typical claim, an applicant would go to the local Social Security office and they would submit their application. Things are a little different in the pandemic, but then once the application is taken by SSA, they send it to DDS, and then we send out records requests. And then to the medical providers, and then they will send us the medical records, and we review them and make a medical decision, and it goes back to the Social Security office for all the technical issues and all the payments. The difference with a SOAR claim is the SOAR rep actually it has most of the records. In theory, is supposed to have most of the records for us when they submit the application to SSA, and then those records are submitted and downloaded or sent to us. And the new process was the examiner then contacts the SOAR rep, and then the SOAR rep is faxed over a barcode to then download or fax over all of the medical records that they have. The MSR is supposed to be included in that. If they have not had the MSR completely done yet, they will let the examiner know, and then that examiner will just be in touch with them. So then what we do is if the SOAR rep cannot provide all of the medical records, if they're having trouble, they just let the examiner know, and then we pick up the pieces, and we send out our request and try to get the request from our end as well. So we still do try to get all of the records, because sometimes we have different ways of getting the records. And so then the MSR is a very crucial part of our claim, because once we get all the records reviewed, then we take a look at the MSR, and we really look at it. The MSR for us tells a story. It tells us what that individual uniquely has going on with them. It tells us their history. It tells us a snapshot of their medical records or medical history. It also lets us know what their work history is like. But the biggest part for a disability examiner is the functional aspect. So we take all of that historical information and all of that objective medical evidence, but then we have to compare it to the functional information. And when I say functional information, I mean what that claimant can do day to day. Can they consistently complete their ADLs? Can they consistently sustain work independently, sustain activity independently? And that is where we really rely on the MSR and the SOAR rep, because you guys see the claimants, we don't, as what was mentioned earlier. So the functional component is really crucial for us. Did that answer your question, Amanda?
Thank you so much. I can't wait to hear more. I can't wait to hear more from you as we go on with the presentation. So I think the best way to think about a medical summary report is that there's part of the medical summary report, and the goal is to provide context and to paint the picture of how the applicant's symptoms and life progressed over time. The second part of a medical summary report, or the second goal, is to provide evidence that the applicant's symptoms or combination of conditions either meet or equal a listing. So there's two frames that we're going to be reviewing this MSR in. The first will be looking at the context, that's the beginning part of the report, and then we'll be looking at the hard evidence and what's going on right now with the applicant that leads to severe functional impairments as a result of their symptoms of mental illness. So it's good to have that as your framework as we're working through the report together. So let's dig in and look at the introduction. I also know that the writing is a little bit small, but you can increase the size of the presentation. Next to the presenter's cameras, there is a little oval that says layout. You can click on that and then click full screen view, and I think it'll be easier to read the slides if you do it that way. All right, so the goal of the introduction is to introduce the applicant and paint the picture of what an encounter with the applicant might be like. As Sumitra mentioned in her portion of the webinar, the examiner most likely will never have any direct communication with the applicant, especially with a SOAR-assisted claim, because they will do most of their communication through us as the SOAR advocate for the applicant. So this is our chance to paint the picture of what an encounter with the applicant might be like so that they can be humanized for the reader and that the DDS examiner can picture who this application is for as they're reading through the report. So we'll dig in and look at a couple of key sentences in the sample MSR. And one goes right to what Sunitra was talking about in her portion and introducing opportunities for implicit bias. So one of the first sentences in this sample introduction is after being arrested for drugs to join the military. These are important details for the reader to know about the applicant's life, but the introduction probably isn't the best part or the best section of the report to add this in. And also, we want to be mindful of our wording to ensure that we are showing respect for the applicant, because above all, we are an advocate, and it is our job to keep them in a light that will lead them to the most highest likely outcome of an approval or favorable decision. So this mentioning, we don't recommend adding a sentence like this into the introduction paragraph of the medical summary report. We also want to be mindful of using person-first language. So in this sample, the sentence says, Michael has been diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic and has post-traumatic stress disorder. An alternative to this wording would be to say that Michael has a diagnosis of schizophrenia paranoid type as well as post-traumatic stress disorder, and then go on to also list his physical health conditions in this section. Remember to always list all conditions that the applicant experiences in the introduction because it provides context for the rest of the report. The DDS examiner will be able to see how certain diagnoses or symptoms fit into the progression of the applicant's life if they know up front all of the conditions that they are going to be considering while reading the medical summary report. And then the last sentence I also want to touch on, he has a polysubstance dependence diagnosis as well as, and then they listed some of his physical conditions. So again, polysubstance dependence or a substance use diagnosis is not considered a disabling condition on SSA's listings. So we do not need to include that diagnosis in the introduction. We do need to address substance use in the medical summary report, but this is an opportunity for us to lessen the impact of implicit bias if we are saving that information for a section of the report where we can provide more context, like how have the applicant's symptoms led to the substance use? What does their functioning look like while they're using the substances versus when they are feeling sober? Because we want to paint the picture of the applicant's functioning and talk about the context of how their symptoms fit into their personal lives and their experiences trying to maintain employment. So the last section states he is very cautious and suspicious of others in his surroundings. So that is the only sentence in this introduction sample that really touches on his presentation. And while those are good descriptors, he's cautious and suspicious of others, you could be more detailed here. What does that mean that he's cautious and suspicious of others? Are there any quotes you can provide from the applicant that really dig in and show a good specific example of a time when he was cautious or suspicious of others during your interaction with him? Again, this is our opportunity to give a really vivid picture of what an encounter with the applicant might look like. So Carrie, talking about implicit bias, can you tell us a little bit about how DDS examiners avoid implicit bias when they're reviewing claims? And if DDS examiners undergo any type of implicit bias training?
Well, we don't have specific training at the moment for disability examiners, but the examiners do go through a 16-week training program as new examiners, and part of that training is we really talk about all the biases and stuff that can affect their ability to make a fair judgment on the claim. Just what's been talked about here. The managers at DDS have been mandated to take a DEI training, so that we've already gone through the training for that. And the plan is to have all of the other staff get this training too. It is not scheduled yet, but I know it is on the agenda. So it is a very big topic for us currently, and so they will all be undergoing training.
Thanks, Carrie. One more question before we move on to the personal history section. If an applicant lacks treatment history due to cultural or access barriers, how is that taken into consideration by the examiner, or is there any information that the SOAR representative could provide in the introduction that will let you know that?
Yeah, in a situation like this, it would be helpful to maybe put in the introduction something about there has been limited treatment due to barriers. And then what the examiner will do is they'll dig in and they'll either talk with the SOAR rep or any other collateral source to try to get that collateral information and the background information. And just because somebody doesn't have medical treatment doesn't mean there aren't conditions or issues that exist. So we would probably get current medical evidence and send them, if there isn't much, we would send them to a consultative examination and have that as the objective medical evidence. But that's where we would really have to dive deep into their past on how did they function, get different people that they were involved in, like third-party sources, and all the contacts that you have had with them, caseworkers, anybody that had contact with them is real helpful to describe their functioning. I'm hoping that helps.
Yeah, that was helpful. Thank you for the information. So what I'm gathering from this is that although there may not be a lot of clinical documentation for some applicants, we can dig in and be about those private investigators and get more information from collateral sources and provide quotes and citations from any collateral sources that really describe the applicant's functional impairments.
Absolutely. That's critical for us.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Terry. All right, let's move on to the personal history section. So the personal history section, what we're looking for is 2 to 3 paragraphs of very relative information. And again, going back to the keyword of providing context. So we want to provide context to the applicant's story in the personal history section. You don't necessarily need to tell a novel of the applicant's life story. The goal isn't to have the longest medical summary report. When we're thinking in terms of MSRs, it will be an average of about 6 or 7 pages. So again, we'll have to keep this fairly concise, but we want to dig in on details about any past trauma or family development that led to the progression of symptoms that the applicant experienced. Samitra gave a really good example earlier when she said that if someone's sexual orientation had an impact on, or they had any trauma experience as a result of their sexual orientation, that could be a key detail to describe in the personal history section, because we can provide more context about how those experiences impacted the life and the progression of their life and progression of their symptoms over time. So Carrie, can you tell us what you think are the relative topics to touch on as a DDS examiner? What information are you looking for in the personal history section?
Really, you kind of nailed it when you said like a brief history of their past. But we really want to know, like, especially in a history, in a case where there's mental health issues, is there a family history of mental health issues? Because that can really be significant for us. Have they had psychiatric hospitalizations? We don't need a whole summary of them, but just say they have had inpatient psychiatric hospitalizations. When did the signs and symptoms begin? Or in a physical impairment, when did their physical ailments begin? The incidences of trauma, because that can definitely lead to difficulty later. And really that all kind of ties in to how they're functioning. Again, we don't necessarily need the functional information here, but that personal history really gives us some insight. Yeah, this tells us that there are some real issues that could result in the basically collaborate what their functional issues are currently.
Thanks, Carrie. I think those are really helpful tips for the people tuning into this webinar, because again, the goal of the personal history section is just to set up that context so the DDS examiner can see the full picture of how the applicant's life progressed from childhood. And also talking about any trauma that triggered symptoms. All right, occupational history. So we know DDS examiners need to know about the applicant's occupational history in any work attempt. One key sentence, this applicant in the sample medical summary report, he served 2 tours in Iraq and experienced an IED attack on his tank. That's a very significant event in this person's life. So I think that it would be best to expand on this, talk about how his experiences were in the military, and what his experiences were like, and any symptoms he may have experienced after the IED attack on his tank, what led to him leaving the military. So when we get to the civilian work history, in the sample medical summary report, there's a short, very brief list of the jobs that the applicant held and the years that those jobs were held. It's important to know which jobs the applicant held, but again, we need to go back and provide the context. So when they were working at Cookburger, or when they were working as a cook in January of 2008, this only lasted less than a week. This would be a great opportunity to dig in and explain, why did this work attempt only last 1 week? And did the applicant's symptoms have anything to do with why that work attempt ended after such a short period of time? So Carrie, can you tell us a bit more about what specific types of information examiners need to know when they're reviewing the occupational history section of the report?
Yes, if they have had a lot of jobs, like you were referring to, and very short duration, that's going to help us give us an indication that they have trouble sustaining work. So if you know, work histories are very difficult to get from claimants. I'm going to be quite honest with you. They struggle to remember, and we struggle sometimes to pull that information out of them. But the more jobs that you can pull out of them, the better. Can you hear me yet?
Yep, we could hear you the whole time.
Oh, sorry, my whole computer system just went blank for a second. I apologize. So it's really important to get as many jobs as you can to show kind of the pattern of not being able to sustain work. Where it gets trickier for us, but that's, I think, more for us to deal with later on, is if they're 49 years of age and a half, like just about 50 or older, then we are going to need a much more in-depth work history. But for most people that are under 49, we just need to see a pattern, like were they able to sustain for a long time? And then if they were able to sustain for a long time and then something happened, there was like a traumatic event or something happened, and then all of a sudden they couldn't sustain, that's really important for us too. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you. And I want to add another thing that I forgot to mention. If an applicant has an instance of maintaining employment, but it was a supportive employment, or their work was subsidized, so their employer maybe made some concessions to allow them to maintain work. It's important to talk about that in the MSR so that the disability examiner has more context about how the applicant was able to have a successful work attempt at one time. Substance use is one of the trickiest sections of the medical summary report, and that's why we're going to spend a little bit of time on that today. The goal of the substance use section, contrary to the name, is not to focus so much on the actual substance use. We want to show that the applicant's substance use is not material to their disability, meaning if they were clean and sober, they would still be experiencing significant symptoms and functional limitations. So that is the lens you want to view your substance use history through. It's important to provide some background information about the applicant's substance use history. So for instance, the writer started in this sample report. Michael started drinking at the age of 11. He hid it from his parents. That's good to know he started drinking at a really young age, but we need more context here. What was going on in the applicant's life when he started drinking? That's a very young age for a child to start drinking alcohol. If there was something going on that led to him drinking and the impact that drinking had on his life as a child, it's important to talk about that here. Again, it doesn't need to be several paragraphs, just add an extra sentence or two that helps flesh out that information and provides a bit more context of how this person's substance use progressed over time. One more sentence in this section that I want to touch on is once you talk about the progression of the applicant's substance use and any reasons or explanation or context of how they use substances to self-medicate, then you want to talk about any evidence you can provide, especially if it's clinical evidence that can be documented through substance use treatment records, that talks about the applicant's symptoms and functioning during a period of documented sobriety. So in this section, it says he went to local charity substance abuse treatment for methadone. That might give a good hint to the DDS examiner that, hey, he had treatment. We need to find those records and look at what his treatment looked like and what his symptoms and functioning looked like while he was being treated. But we can go further as SOAR advocates and provide a bit more detail here. So we can talk about key quotes from the treatment records at local charities that describe any clean toxicology or urine screens, and then go one step further and provide direct notes or quotations from the records that document any symptoms he experienced while in treatment and having those clean toxicology screens. Because again, our goal is to show, hey, we know he has a substance use disorder. He does use substances sometimes, but when he's not using, he's still experiencing severe symptoms and limitations in his functioning. So Carrie, this question is for people who are currently using substances while they're applying for benefits. So can you tell us a bit more about when someone is using alcohol or other drugs while they're applying for benefits, what type of information would a DDS examiner need to know to determine the materiality of the applicant's substance use?
Well, you actually hit on it when you said that we have to look at any period of sobriety, and it has to be a significant period. It can't just be a couple days and then we look at their symptoms. We have to have, and the significant period of sobriety is not defined by SSA in true form, but it just means like a pretty good chunk of time so that we can assess if their symptoms are still existing. So it would be important for us to know if they're still using, had there ever been a time when they weren't using and still experiencing symptoms, or did their symptoms really improve when they were not using? If we do not have any period of time when they were not using, meaning they're still using, never stopped, then we cannot find that it is material to the decision. So we really can't factor that in and say, and use it against them, basically. But this one can be a slippery slope, and it's really important to be able to document everything real clearly, like you said, like what was the history and why, you know, were they self-medicating and that kind of thing. This one is, substance abuse is really tricky, but it's hard to find that substance abuse is material unless there's a distinct period of sobriety. Does that help?
Thanks, Carrie. So I think if you're having trouble writing the substance use section in your medical summary report, it's a great opportunity to reach out to your SOAR TA Center liaison and have us review it for you, because we have a lot of experience writing these sections of the report. And we'll give you as much feedback as we can to make sure that you are supporting a favorable decision with your medical summary report. Physical and psychiatric health history. So this is where we're starting to turn the corner. So the first sections we went over was talking about the context and the context of the applicant's life experiences, the context of their symptoms impacting their ability to maintain employment, the context of their substance use as a way to self-medicate or lessen their symptoms, even if it's short term, and then they're functioning while they are experiencing extended periods of sobriety. So now we're going to turn gears a little bit and talk about the evidence. So this information primarily should be coming from quotes and direct citations from the treatment records, if we can provide that. For physical health history, our goal is to discuss any physical conditions that were listed in the introduction. You don't want to leave anything unaddressed, and to support that with as much clinical documentation as possible. So you can provide a sentence about how the applicant's back pain affects their functioning, but then go a step further and say his back pain was observed by Dr. John on, provide the date and a quote from the records that addresses the applicant's back pain. Another key point that you'll want to focus on, if you can, is to discuss how the applicant's mental health symptoms have impacted their ability to care for their physical needs. Because this provides the full picture of how this applicant is functioning and how their symptoms can impact many areas of their lives. We know a lot of applicants who are experiencing severe depression may avoid caring for their physical health due to struggles with leaving the house, and that's just one example. So Carrie, how can a SOAR caseworker help ensure all conditions are taken into consideration when an applicant lacks medical treatment history? So like that example, someone has been very depressed for a long time. They haven't followed up with treatment, but they are experiencing severe back pain or severe knee pain. How can we advocate for them in the medical summary report?
State that specifically how you just stated. Say, you know, their depression has prevented them from getting treatment, because we are required to document any unalleged allegations. Like even if they didn't allege asthma, we have to take the asthma into consideration. We have to take any impairment, whether it's physical or medical, or physical or mental impairment, and kind of document that completely. We have to get objective medical evidence. So in a situation like this where they did not get any physical treatment, we would send them for a medical exam, a consultative exam, and maybe get x-rays depending on what the situation is. So we would have to document and get objective medical evidence so that we are giving him or her a fair shot at looking at all of their impairments and how they all interact together.
Thanks, Carrie. I think this is really good insight to hear as a provider, because sometimes I know this, I'm talking from my own personal experience. When I first started off doing SOAR work, was if I didn't have documentation of a physical impairment, I was a little weary about providing that impairment in the medical summary report because I didn't have that documentation. But it sounds like as long as we mention it and describe what we know about it, to prepare our applicants to attend a consultative exam if there are not records that we can cite within the MSR.
Yes, it potentially, you know, we don't automatically have to send them for one. For example, if we have enough medical records on the mental health side to allow them, then we don't have to send them for a physical exam. But it's when we don't have enough to allow on the one side, then we have to document every single impairment that's mentioned. So yes, it's very important to mention all impairments, all complaints, all allegations. And then we will take care of getting the exam scheduled and, you know, go through you and let them know. But it would be good to prep them that you may need to go do an exam.
Understood. Thanks, Carrie. All right, let's move on to the psychiatric history. So again, in this section of the MSR, our focus is to provide the medical documentation necessary to illustrate the symptoms that are provided within the listing of the condition the applicant experiences. When I write my psychiatric history sections, I start with a really brief overview of initial symptoms and then provide a sentence or two that describes how those symptoms may have progressed to the point of the applicant seeking treatment for the first time. Discuss that first treatment episode, just again, to provide context of how this applicant's conditions have progressed over time, and then provide a bit more detailed for more recent psychiatric treatment. So in this example, when we're reviewing treatment history, it states in 2006, he was treated for post-traumatic stress disorder with paroxetine and instructed to take 20 milligrams daily. In 2007, Mr. Burns was treated for bipolar disorder and describes the medications he was given, and he was also given Benadryl for anxiety or agitation. So what is missing from these sentences are the context. What led to him being treated in 2006 for the post-traumatic stress disorder? What symptoms are documented within the medical records? And let's provide a citation for those symptoms from an intake or discharge summary that describes the symptoms the applicant was experiencing, what impacted the prescribed medications have on his functioning and symptoms. Did he follow the prescribed treatment protocol? And if so, what did his symptoms look like a week later or a couple of months later when he is following his prescribed treatment? If he did not follow the prescribed treatment, talk about what symptoms interfered with the applicant following the treatment protocol. So again, going back and providing context for what led to hospitalizations and direct quotes from the medical records that detail the applicant's symptoms, because to meet Part A of the listing, it needs to be, the medical documentation needs to come from an acceptable medical source, like a psychiatrist or a PhD or psychologist. Another tip that we have for you is going back to that DEI Considerations Addendum that Sunitra talked about earlier in the presentation. So you can use that addendum to facilitate conversations with the applicant to talk about how any cultural norms impacted their comfort or ability to engage in mental health treatment. And that is something we come across a lot when we're providing our SOAR work. If something kept the applicant from engaging in treatment for their mental health symptoms, even though they were experiencing severe symptoms. So it's helpful as the advocate to provide the context of what was going on there, that although these symptoms have been observed, this is why we don't have the medical evidence to document it, to give the DDS examiner some background information of understanding the applicant's personal history, and more information about why a consultative exam may be called for within the context of an applicant like this. Carrie, can you tell us what the ideal organizational strategy is for the layout of the applicant's treatment history? So there's two frames of thought that people use for the MSRs that I reviewed. Chronological order, or for most recent treatment episode first and working back.
I don't think there's a preferred method. Each examiner has their own way of summarizing, just like I'm sure that you guys have your own way of summarizing. So as long as it goes in chronological order, that, you know, and kind of tells the story, that's the important thing. I do think it might be more beneficial in a situation on an MSR to go in chronological order, like you said, because it gives the historical information, like this is when they first started treatment, and this is what led to it, and this is what their hospitalization was, this is their diagnoses, this is when they had their meds changed. And then, again, if they did not continue with followed prescribed treatment, which is very common in psychiatric cases, then explain why and kind of, like you said, indicate what was going on. But I don't think that there needs to be any preferred method. It's whatever flows best for the writer.
Thanks, Carrie. All right, let's move on to the functional information section. So we only address one functional area in this sample medical summary report, but we want to make it clear that when you're writing MSRs, you should always address all 4 areas of functioning by including one beefy paragraph, so at least 8 or 10 sentences, because Carrie has said it a few times. This is the information that's really key when PDS examiners get that medical summary report, is being able to really provide comprehensive overviews of the applicant's functioning. So for this example, it starts with applicant, and we're looking at the understand, remember, or apply information functional area. Applicant has a hard time understanding information, stating that the noise inside his head is too much and causes him to lose focus and get agitated. And I will say that's actually a pretty good sentence to start off with for the functional information section. The issue is that it needs to be followed up with more context. So you can have this statement from the applicant, a direct quote from the applicant that talks about that he's experiencing auditory hallucination. But let's follow that up with a specific example of a time you observed him having an auditory hallucination and how it impacted his ability to understand information or follow directions, either in a work setting or in an interview with you as the writer of the medical summary report. So this is our opportunity to dig in a bit deeper. We know that he's experiencing symptoms through this hallucination and that it does cause him to lose focus. But the goal of the medical summary report is really to paint a vivid picture. And you can go one step further to talk about how those symptoms he's experiencing are observed in a real life setting. Another example from this functional description is applicant is unable to maintain a steady job due to his lack of understanding. So this is a wording pattern we see a lot when we're reviewing medical summary reports at the TA center. And again, you need to go a bit further than this. So his lack of understanding is a very vague statement. So instead of having a really generalized sentence like this, you could go further, provide more context, talk about the specific symptoms the applicant experiences, and then give a direct example of your observations or observations you were able to get from a former employer that discusses how the applicant's symptoms impact their ability to understand information and follow directions in a work-life setting. So Carrie, just a couple more questions for you. And we so appreciate all of the time that you've put into this webinar for us. This is a treat for SOAR providers to get to hear directly from someone at DDS. Can you talk a little bit about how a DDS examiner determines the level of impairment as it relates to an applicant's functional limitations? So for example, in the SOAR online course, we teach that there are 4 levels of impairment: mild, moderate, marked, and severe. How does DDS weigh evidence to determine an applicant's level of impairment?
We always say it's on a case-by-case basis, so it's really hard to put a number on things. But in general, if you want to say mild, it would be very, very infrequently has issues with it. Moderate, maybe 1/3 of the time. Marked, maybe half the time, and then severe, maybe 2/3 of the time. That's kind of a standard of what we kind of consider, but it's all depending on the situation. It's hard to really describe. Like, for example, the example you had about the difficulty learning, or hard to keep a job because he had difficulty learning. Well, specifically, you'd want to know, did he have difficulty? What did he have difficulty learning? Was it a complex task or was it a simple task? He had to get instructions repeated to him occasionally. Well, that's not a huge, problem, right? But he had to have instructions repeated to him like 4 times before he would understand what the task was. He had to be reminded to go mop the bathroom every time on his shift. Stuff like that would be more indicative of how severe of an impairment they had and how severe functionally they were.
All right, that's really good to know. So I think making sure you're talking about frequency of experiencing functional limitations is important to touch on, along with the specific examples of what the limitation is and how it is linked to the applicant's symptoms.
Absolutely. The is very important. And the one other thing, if I could add, like if they were able to complete a task, well, how well were they able to complete it? Like, did he mop the bathroom, but he missed, all the stuff that was on the floor? Like, it was a really poor job. So somebody can say that they can take care of their own, needs or take care of their work tasks, but if they're not completed to the standards that we would think that they should be completed to, then that's also an indication of the severity of their impairment.
Thank you, Carrie. So those are all the questions I have for you. Thanks again for joining me for this discussion. I hope that everyone participating in the webinar found this helpful and maybe got some good pointers for your future medical summary reports. A reminder to reach out to your TA Center liaison, and we are always happy to review your completed medical summary reports before you send them off for that co-signature.
Thanks, Amanda and Carrie, for that deep dive into the MSR. We did get some great questions that came in about documenting work. So at the end, we'll probably share some questions about documenting work, if it's done while an individual is incarcerated or even has limited work experience, how to document how well an individual does something in a work setting or even everyday types of activities. So thanks again. Now we're going to hand it over to Lauren and Jennifer with SAFE in Austin, who's going to illustrate how to gather the information in a way that is compassionate, thoughtful, to gather this information that can be sometimes difficult to gather. So I'm going to hand it off to Lauren and Jennifer, who's going to, in conversation, share some tips about MSR writing and then go into a little dialogue afterwards. Lauren, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. So these are just some tips. I'm a SOAR benefits specialist, so I'm a SOAR advocate. So this is kind of some things I do when I'm writing my MSR. I do think that the MSR guide that we have on our SOAR website does give you a great starting point. So you kind of have ideas of what types of questions to ask your participants. I do like to tell my participants that they're always able to not answer a question and that they're in control of the interview. If it gets to be too much, they're able to stop the interview at any point. This helps establish trust with them, as well as it gives them some control, because we can get pretty deep into some issues and stuff with them. I do also try to break up the MSR paper into several different appointments so that it doesn't overwhelm our clients. And I also like to let them know before we start what the process kind of looks like, so they have a little bit of time to prepare and know exactly what it is we're getting into. One thing I want people to be aware of is you need to be aware a lot of the questions we have to ask can be very triggering for a participant. So they could need additional support to help deal with sort of trauma or anything else that these questions can bring up. Also, I try not to push my clients if they say they are not comfortable with answering a question. I try to use medical records whenever I can to fill in any blanks that was left by our MSR interview with my client. That way, I don't have to fully rely on them, but it also gives them the option to decline to answer certain things. And then for writing your MSR as well, when you're speaking with your client, pay very close attention to any sort of visual auditory clues that they're giving you. We do ask very private information, so remain aware of their verbal and visual clues so that you're not pushing them too far. Some participants may not want to say, I'm done with this interview, because they don't want to disappoint you or they don't want to hurt their claim. So if you see that they're really kind of struggling, or that it's been too long, or, you know, fidgeting, having issues, pay attention to that. So that way you can always ask them, like, would you like to stop? Do you want to continue? That way they're still in control, and also you don't ruin that rapport you've built with them. Also, not every question from the MSR guide will be pertinent to each client you work with. So I try to review the MSR guide before doing any interviews with my clients and determine what questions or what types of questions would be most pertinent to them and their specific case. That way you don't ask a bunch of questions that aren't necessary and overwhelm your client. And then also you can add your own questions to the MSR guide, reword any questions on the guide. The guide's just really there to help, and it's not meant to be done word for word, but when you're first starting, it is really helpful. But as you've kind of done a few with clients, you'll learn how to, you know, better phrase things, or what works and what doesn't. And then always just make sure you're respectful of your participants' time and concerns around this process. If they have questions about it, make sure you answer those. The client should really be the one in charge of the interview. So I started with SOAR just a little bit before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. So before the pandemic, most of our interviews were done in person, which made it easier and made it seem more like a conversation as opposed to an interview. Now, most of my conversations with my clients or my MSR interviews are being done over the phone or virtually. So you don't have as many clues as to your participants' well-being. So this makes auditory clues like sighing, sniffling, crying, things like that much more important to pick up on. Because I mean, if you make your client cry, it might be time to end that interview and try again a different day. Or if they don't want to end, we may need to switch gears and go into a different section. Also, I like to be upfront with my clients at this time that it's nearly impossible to make a virtual interview not seem like an interview. I try to make it as conversational as possible, but when you're on the phone, you're basically asking questions and hoping to get answers from them. So I kind of prepare them for the interview, make sure that they know they're in control and that they can stop at any time. And then, since most of us are working from home, or a lot of us are, be aware of background noise from home, because if you're speaking with a client about something very private, it can be very disconcerting to hear like your children, your spouse, or your pet going off in the background. And that can also make your client worried about who's overhearing what they're saying. Most of the time I'll use like a headset, Bluetooth, so nobody else can hear them, but I still try to find a nice quiet spot to go. I have a couple dogs. They get kind of annoying, so I try to make sure they're put up and away, so that way we're not being distracted by my dogs barking, and they're not worried that, you know, if my son's talking in the other room, that somebody can hear what we're discussing. And then I do like to follow up with my clients with like a phone call, a text, email, whichever way they prefer, just to check to see how they're doing and give them the opportunity to discuss any sort of feelings or traumas or triggers that maybe this interview process brought up for them, so I can give them the best resources or just be an ear to, listen to them vent about, certain things that may have been brought up. And then I do try to space my interviews a few days apart to give my clients time to kind of process and recover from each of our appointments, because I try to make them usually between like 30 minutes to an hour long, but it depends on each client what they're able to handle. And that's the last point, is really don't try to make them any longer than an hour virtually. This can be pretty overwhelming and exhausting to your client. Plus, you get kind of tired of talking and quizzing them too. So kind of is a nice way to break it up. I've had clients where we needed like 6 30-minute appointments. I've had clients where we needed 2 1-hour appointments. So just kind of gauge it with each client, but I've never really seen anyone do very well over an hour virtually. It's all up to our individual participants and clients, but that's typically what I see. And then I have a former client of mine, Jennifer. We applied for her disability back in June of 2020. We were originally denied and we appealed, and then we finally got approved. So she's been through this process not once, but twice, because after our original denial, I again went back and asked some additional questions of Jennifer. And so, Jennifer, I just had a few questions for you. Can you tell me?
Hello.
Hi, thanks for being here. I really appreciate the help.
Sure, no problem.
So how did you feel about the whole MSR interview process?
I was very nervous. To me, it was very, just a lot of anxiety, especially if you know in advance that it's coming up. So that part was a little bit difficult, just the anxiety and the of knowing, am I going to answer the questions right? Are they going to be wrong answers? And so that, I think, and the fact that it was so lengthy, that was also, hard for me. But as long as, like you made it very clear to me ahead of time that it was going to be long, but we could break it up, like you just said. So the whole process to me was long, lengthy, a little bit of anxiety, a little bit of nervousness. Hoping my answers were right. Were they right or were they wrong? Things like that.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. And there's never any wrong answers, but I can certainly understand
Right.
how you felt that way. Was there anything that I specifically did that made you feel more comfortable with the MSR process?
Oh yeah, a whole lot. You're the best advocate, let me just say. But you also made me feel comfortable about letting me know, like ahead of time, that we're going to break this up at any time. If you want to stop this, Jennifer, we can stop this. I'll call you back in a couple of days. It doesn't have to be the next day. You if you felt like I was, stuttering on something, you kind of helped me through it. So, and having a good rapport with me, you're always checking on me, things like that, making sure I was okay during the whole time that we were applying and appealing and all that. So I think just the whole rapport of me and you, that being good between us, that was very helpful.
Well, I appreciate that. What would you think was the most important thing for you to tell me during this process?
Just, I probably, even though some of it was hard to say to you because, you might judge me or whatever, I think just being honest and straightforward with you and having you make me feel like I can be, that was a hard part too. So the trust issue came into play effect right there too. But I guess that would be about it.
Thank you. So when I'm asking you all these very personal questions, what were you kind of thinking?
Well, that it had to be done. it had to be done in order for the disability office to get correct, uh, correct and accurate information on me, on my case, so that they can determine, whether I was, needed the benefits or not. So just, making sure that that information was put out there. That's very important.
I appreciate
I
that. And
forgot.
I know we always talked about how honesty was important.
Mhm.
Anything that you told me was just between the two of us until I shared it with, the
Right,
DDS rep. But just
right.
so that you knew, like, we aren't talking to other people in the company about any of that. So that way, hopefully, it made you feel a little better about being honest. And
For
what
sure,
would
for
you
sure.
want? Thank you. What would you want other case managers to kind of know about this process or things that they can do?
Um, I think to go into it like with each client, is different, just because like I think Amanda said, something about them, being a drug addict or whatever. I just think it's a case by case basis and make sure that you go into it being a little bit empathetic. That does, that always helps make us feel more comfortable with the advocate. Starting to build some kind of relationship is very important too, between me and the advocate, or the client and the advocate. I think that's very important. Um, and just knowing that you made it clear that you're all there to help us. So that would be basically about all I would have on that. Mm. I don't know.
No, you're perfectly fine. Can you tell me a
Okay.
little bit about how you felt after we were finished with the MSR process, either the first time or the second time, because I made you do it twice.
Right. I felt relief. That's about relief. That was the big one. Um, and then I also questioned myself on different things like, oh, maybe I should have said this, or I forgot to put in this, and so just like the details, like whether or not, I said everything, whether or not I included all my, things that I wanted to include, um, things like that.
Certainly. And you were very detailed with your information, which was really helpful and I think really helped our case. But what did you feel like was most important to you during the whole MSR process?
Um, Probably the most important part was, I had a lot of work history. Well, not a lot, but I worked a lot for this. A lot of, yeah, I did. I had many years working. So just remembering all of that, coming up with dates and things like that. Um, that was very difficult for me. So I think just probably knowing that, I don't know, just, trying to get out the most clear and accurate information as possible, knowing that it's hard to remember some of the things. I know for me, because of some of my issues that I have, my memory's not as clear, and so the difficulty on trying to get all that information correct.
Yeah, and I mean, we did good. I remember we, tried to write down anything we came up with at the time, little things like that that help as well. But yeah, I mean, I honestly don't think I could remember 100% of the things I've done either, so it's certainly understandable. But did you find that this MSR process helped you better understand your disabilities or your diagnosis?
um, Possibly. Um, I no, I mean possibly. I just think that it was needed to be done, and that I made sure. I know it helped the process as far as getting my benefits. Um, so it was very important, part of the whole process. So yeah.
Thank you. Was there anything I did or anything that you think maybe other advocates are doing as well during the MSR process that you didn't like?
Um,
Time to be honest, Jennifer. Let us know.
It's hard on the phone. So, because I was post COVID or no, yeah,
Yeah, no, we were on the phone.
yeah, and so that part to me was hard. So I guess if the advocate, since it is COVID still, just making sure that that part right there is, I don't know if there's something different, we could do, being, instead of just being on the phone, making sure they have access to something with the camera or something. Maybe that would probably be the only, and I know sometimes you were always good about it, but making sure that they were available. I know during work hours, but most of the time to get a hold of somebody, because it's hard for, for us to, we like to, I guess, whatever at the time is on our mind and we need to speak to you on it. I know it's hard for us to get in touch with each other just because y'all are so busy, but maybe making that a little bit more easier.
Certainly. And then I do remember you did say I was a bit wordy, so sometimes I can ramble. So that happens sometimes. So we both have to,
That's true. Yeah, but no, it was good.
remember we're all
Yeah,
human,
and like you gave me the option of texting or like, to me, texting is easier for me because I get a little bit more shyer on the phone. So I'm pretty easier with writing it, so I would say probably more of my honest, information with honesty probably by text. So I guess having that option is a good thing too. Whether you want to talk on the phone or text is easier or whatever.
Yeah, so flexibility and how many different mediums we can contact, whether it's phone, text, email.
Yeah, making sure that client actually has access to something, because it's hard when they don't have access to be able to contact anybody,
Certainly. And then last but not least, what advice would you give to other advocates like myself or other clients going through this MSR process?
As far as probably just to keep on it, as far as clients, like to, don't give up. It's a long process. It took me 3 years. Well, not with you, but I had another, person that tried to help me once before. So just that is time consuming just to keep on it. And for as far as advocates, just making sure that, they keep a good rapport with the client, making sure that they are empathetic with their issues, and it's all done case by case and not, don't stereotype them as being a certain way.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate you doing me this favor and coming here and talking. But yeah, from start to finish for your case, I think we ended up being at about 15 months total. So even though you had done it previously, we still took a long time, unfortunately, it felt like. But we got there.
We got there. We did. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren and Jennifer, for sharing your, relationship with writing the MSR. And I'm just so glad you're helping so many caseworkers out there do a better job. Thank you so much. Now, we had some great questions come in. Now it's time to open up for the last 10 minutes. The Q&A box, that's how you're going to do it. Type in your question. If we don't get to it, we will make sure the panelists answer this after the webinar. But some great questions did come in. And I think this one is really great because it kind of ended on it to hang in there. What do you tell clients who say everyone gets denied the first time? In that case, you did get denied, but not every. What do you tell clients about that? And they just don't want to go through the process because you're just going to get denied. So this can be Lauren or Jennifer to say, what do you say about that?
So what I would say is I typically tell them, with the SOAR process, we tend to get higher approvals than, say, I call it the old-fashioned way, which is just applying on your own, and kind of let them know what the whole process looks like from start to beginning. Like in the beginning, I'm going to ask you where you've been to the doctor, these medical records, so I can request them and get the evidence. Once we have the evidence, then there's getting together and filing the claim, doing the MSR interview process, and then there's the wait to see if you get approved or not. Pre-COVID, the times were a little faster. Post-COVID, they can be a little longer. I know with like Jennifer's case specifically, we filed, and I think it took 5 months for the initial case to be denied. And then I did the appeal within the 60 days with, of course, Jennifer's help. And the appeal only took, I want to say, 3 months, which was kind of quick after post-COVID. It was pretty quick. So that was nice. But then, I'm adding in the time that we took to get everything prior to filing. But yeah, I just try to be honest, like, here's what the steps are. Here's kind of what the SOAR process is. And as we move from like step 1 to what I say is step 2, I let them know, like, here's where we are at in the process. And then once we filed, I let them know, like, on average, 3 to 6 months or so for an answer. But, I'll try to keep you updated weekly with, if I've heard from DDS or what's going on. And so just a little bit of an encouragement, like each step of the way, like, hey, look, we're halfway done. Or, hey, we filed, like the hard part for us is kind of over. Now we wait. So I don't know. You have any opinion on that, Jennifer?
Oh no, you were good at that. Trying to be positive about the whole thing and a little yay and hooray and stuff like that. It was always good to hear. But no, I would just keep your head up. It is a long process. Don't be afraid to ask your advocate for resources to help you get by. That's what they're there for.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. And also, we had a question come in about giving a copy of the MSR to the applicant. It sounds like a very collaborative process between Jennifer and Lauren, very collaborative. What about, and again, Amanda and Sumitra can chime in too, do you give a copy of the MSR to your client to review before submitting? What is your experience with this?
So I typically will ask them if they want a copy. Most of them, and I believe Jennifer, you said no. Most of them are like, it was just hard enough to get it out there. I don't necessarily want to know what you wrote, but I kind of let them know, like, when we start the process, this is kind of how it is. I'm painting a picture. That's my favorite phrase to use, is I'm painting a picture of how your symptoms and disabilities affect your daily life. So, you may not like seeing it in black and white when it's kind of painted out there, but that's what helps DDS the best. And I think I've had one client actually ask for it. And she was a former English teacher, and she said I was really good at writing. But I mean, she said she kind of had to look at it from the point of view like it was about somebody else, because it felt too much knowing it was about her. But I really, before I gave it to her, went over like, listen, here's kind of the criteria of what I'm doing. I don't, because it was a little nerve wracking to be like, this is all I wrote. And it's all honest and truth and stuff you told me, but kind of seeing it in black and white can sometimes be a little stark. So I think I try to steer my clients kind of away from that. But, if they really want to, just like, at the end, I can provide you with all your medical records as well and stuff. That's kind of our policy. So you can have it all, but just know that, reading what the doctor wrote about you isn't always super pleasant.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, I think Lauren. Sorry. I think Lauren made some really, really good points. I know typically when I was writing MSRs, I would, if the applicant wanted to, I would try to involve them, make it collaborative right from the beginning. So as I'm interviewing them and we're talking about certain topics, like typically I have them sitting next to me, I'd have the computer in front of us, I'd be taking notes, and I'd kind of check in with them, like, is this accurate? Is this how you feel? Is this fair? What do you think about that? So really kind of having them involved from the start, being able to see what I'm writing down and kind of getting their input. Kind of like Lauren said, I like to kind of set that expectation right from the beginning.
Thank you. Yeah, so we had a question that came up, and I think it was the very beginning in the introduction or personal history section when we use personal names, maybe Catherine, the sister. And this could be for Carrie and Amanda too. When is it appropriate or not appropriate to list personal names? You need authorizations, permission from other third parties in the MSR. What's a rule of thumb for that?
So with my experience, when I would meet with the applicant for our initial meeting to get releases signed, I would have them sign releases for any collateral source that they could think of. So if it is a sibling or a parent or grandparent, aunt or uncle, close friend who has been able or who is able to provide some information about their symptoms or their life history, and we'll get a release signed. I'll call that person and follow up with them and let them know that a release has been signed to speak with you. I have permission to talk with you. I may be reaching out for some follow-up information. I don't think it's necessary to list names when you're talking about their family composition or something like that. You don't need to list the names of every person that lived in the house. But if you're providing a specific quote from a support person, you can definitely address them by name within the medical summary report, so that the DDS examiner will know who this quote is coming from and what their relationship is to the applicant. But again, you don't need to list names of all of their siblings if only one sibling is providing collateral information for your report.
Great, thanks. Yeah, another great question about MSRs that aren't signed. Unfortunately, this one case manager has had 2 doctors not sign the MSR. Should you still submit it? And this could be Amanda, and then maybe Carrie can jump in and talk about some of the functional information that's in it.
So one of the critical components of a SOAR-assisted case is to get a co-signature on your medical summary report, and we recommend you strive for that. But we also understand that sometimes it's not possible to get a co-signature from a treating source on your medical summary report. And that's okay, because I'm going to hand things over to Carrie to give the DDS's perspective, but functional information can come from a collateral source. And you're using direct quotes and citations from the treatment records that document the applicant's symptoms and functioning. So you're still referring to treatment records within the MSR. It's still really valuable information, especially the information about the applicant's functioning and the context of how their symptoms began and progressed over time. Carrie, do you want to weigh in on your perspective on if it's valuable to submit an unco-signed MSR?
It absolutely is valuable. It is still crucial, like you said, for us to get that collateral information, to get that supportive information, the functional information. As long as we have an acceptable medical source in file, meaning like a doctor, a psychiatrist, we have a whole list of acceptable medical sources. We don't need that cosigned. It is beneficial to be cosigned because then we can give it greater weight, but it is still very, very helpful for us. So yes, please still send those in.
Great. Thanks. I'm glad we ended on that. We have some questions we didn't get to. Don't worry, we'll get them to the panelists. We'll provide a response to you shortly. So we are out of time. Thanks again to all the panelists. We ask also that you take a moment to complete an evaluation, which you'll see upon exiting. We have some resources here for you to take a look at. Make sure you review them, reach out to your TA Center liaison for further support. And we, again, really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to learn more about the medical summary report. And again, we really, hope that this information, we know this information is going to help you make better SOAR-trained practitioners. So again, thank you for joining us. And again, have a great day, and we appreciate it. And we look forward to seeing you in a couple months for our next series of webinars. Stay tuned. Bye-bye.